blade whistled through the air, missing Cynthia Flores by mere inches as she stumbled backward against the cold stone wall of the castle courtyard. Her wedding dress, torn and bloodstained, caught on the rough stones as James Ortiz stepped between her and the assassin who had emerged from the shadows during what should have been her wedding feast. This knight she had chosen from among her father's options moved with deadly precision, his dark armor gleaming in the torchlight as he parried another strike meant for her throat. "Stay behind me," James commanded, his voice low and steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The wedding guests had scattered, screaming, as more armed figures poured through the castle gates. This was no random attack. Someone wanted her dead on her wedding night, and the realization sent ice through her veins. Cynthia pressed herself against the wall, watching in fascination and terror as her new husband fought with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. When her father, Lord Kevin Bailey, had presented her with 3 potential husbands to choose from, she had picked James purely because something about his dark eyes and scarred hands had called to her. Now she understood why the other knights had looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. The assassin fell, James's sword finding its mark with surgical precision. But even as that threat ended, Cynthia could hear the sounds of battle echoing from the great hall. Her wedding day had become a battlefield, and she was the prize they were fighting over. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clash of steel. James turned to her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not just determination, but a fierce protectiveness that seemed to burn from within. "Someone who believes you should not have lived to see this day," he said simply. But they were wrong. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story had begun 3 months earlier, when Cynthia's world had crumbled in a single afternoon. She had been tending to her garden behind the small cottage she shared with her mother when the messenger arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. The news he brought changed everything. Her father, the lord she had never known, was dead, and she was his only heir. Lord Kevin Bailey had been a stranger to her, a man who had abandoned her mother before Cynthia was born. Yet his death had thrust her into a world of politics and power she never wanted. The messenger explained that she must come immediately to claim her inheritance or risk losing everything to distant relatives who would see her mother thrown into the streets. The journey to her father's castle had been a nightmare of mud and rain, each mile taking her further from the simple life she had known. When she finally arrived, wet and exhausted, she found herself face to face with Peter Carter, her father's advisor, a thin man with calculating eyes, who looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved. "Your father left specific instructions," Peter had told her that first evening, as she sat in the great hall that felt more like a tomb than a home. "You are to marry within 3 months, or forfeit your claim to the lands." He believed a woman could not rule alone. The words had hit her like physical blows. Not only was she being forced into this strange new life, but she was expected to bind herself to a stranger to keep it. "And if I refuse?" Peter's smile had been cold. "Then you and your mother will have nothing. The lands will pass to your father's cousin, Wayne Powell, who has made it clear that he has no intention of supporting your mother's continued existence." That night, alone in her father's chambers, Cynthia had wept for the life she was losing and the impossible choice she faced. Through the narrow window, she could see the village below, filled with people who depended on these lands for their survival. If she walked away, they would suffer under Wayne Powell's rule. If she stayed, she would be trapped in a marriage to a man chosen for political convenience rather than any feeling. The 3 suitors Peter presented to her a week later had been exactly what she expected. Ryan Carter, Peter's nephew, was young and eager, but looked at her with the hunger of a man who saw only her inheritance. Kevin Bailey's former ally, a lord from the neighboring lands, was old enough to be her grandfather and spoke of her as if she were livestock to be managed. Then there was James Ortiz. He had stood apart from the others, dressed in simple black clothing that somehow made him seem more imposing than the elaborate finery of his competitors. His face was weathered, marked by scars that spoke of battles fought and survived. When Peter introduced him, he had simply nodded to her, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Sir James served your father as a knight," Peter had explained, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely pleased by James's presence among the suitors. He has no lands of his own, but his sword arm is strong. The implication was clear. James was the least advantageous choice politically, a landless knight who could offer her nothing but his protection. Yet when she looked at him, she felt something she had not expected. Not love, not yet, but a recognition that ran deeper than rational thought. Here was a man who understood what it meant to fight for survival. The courtship period that followed had been unlike anything she might have imagined. While Ryan Carter brought her gifts and flowery speeches, and the elderly lord spoke endlessly of the political advantages their union would bring, James simply appeared each morning to escort her through her daily duties. He said little, but his presence was steady and reassuring in a way that surprised her. It was during these quiet walks that she began to notice things about him, the way he positioned himself between her and any potential threat, even something as minor as a startled horse. How his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, not with paranoia but with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned that danger could come from anywhere. The careful way he spoke to the servants and villagers, showing a respect that the other suitors never bothered with. "Why did you offer for me?" she had asked him one morning as they stood on the castle walls, looking out over the lands that would soon be hers to protect. James had been quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Your father saved my life once. I owed him a debt. And you think marrying me will repay that debt?" "I think," he said carefully, "that these lands need someone who will fight for them, and you need someone who will fight for you." The simple honesty of his words had moved her more than all of Ryan's poetry or the elderly lord's promises of wealth. Here was a man who saw her situation clearly, without romantic illusions or political calculations. He was offering her a partnership based on mutual need and respect, nothing more and nothing less. That night, she had made her decision. When Peter asked for her choice the next morning, she had looked directly at James and said, "I choose Sir James Ortiz." The reaction had been immediate and telling. Ryan had gone pale with fury, while the elderly lord had simply shrugged and taken his leave. But it was Peter's expression that had troubled her most. For just a moment, she had seen something like fear flicker across his features before he composed himself and began discussing wedding arrangements. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been filled with preparations that felt more like preparations for war. James had quietly begun making changes to the castle's defenses, bringing in men he trusted and dismissing others whose loyalty seemed questionable. When Cynthia asked him about it, he had simply said, "Your father had enemies. It would be foolish to assume they died with him." She had wanted to ask more, but something in his manner warned her that there were things he was not ready to share. Instead, she focused on learning to manage the household and the estate, tasks that felt overwhelming but necessary. The servants seemed to accept her authority readily enough, perhaps because James's support made it clear that she was not just a temporary figurehead. It was Carol Peterson, an older woman who had served as her father's housekeeper, who finally gave her some insight into the man she was about to marry. "Sir James came to us 5 years ago," Carol had told her one evening as they worked together in the solar, "half dead from wounds that should have killed him. Your father took him in, gave him a place when no one else would." "Why wouldn't anyone else take him in?" Cynthia had asked. Carol's hands had stilled on the tapestry she was mending. "There were rumors about things that happened during the war. Some said he was a killer who had turned against his own lord. Others said he was cursed, that death followed in his wake." She looked up at Cynthia with serious eyes. "But I saw how he cared for your father in his final illness. Whatever he was before, he is a man of honor now." The conversation had left Cynthia with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of comfort. James had found redemption in service to her father. Perhaps their marriage could offer him something similar, and perhaps she could find in him the strength she needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The wedding ceremony itself had been a small affair, attended only by the household and a few neighboring lords who had come more out of curiosity than friendship. Cynthia had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried flowers from the garden she had been forced to leave behind. When she walked down the aisle of the castle's chapel, James had been waiting for her in his finest clothes. his expression solemn but not unkind. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, speaking of honor and protection, obedience and faithfulness. But when James placed the ring on her finger, his touch had been gentle, and when he kissed her to seal their union, she had felt something unexpected pass between them. Not passion, not yet, but the beginning of something that might in time become much more. The wedding feast that followed had been more elaborate than the ceremony, with tables groaning under the weight of food and wine. Cynthia had sat beside her new husband, accepting congratulations from guests while trying to ignore the undercurrents of tension she sensed in the room. James had been watchful throughout the evening, his hand never far from his sword hilt, though he tried to hide his vigilance behind a facade of celebration. It was Carol Walker, a young woman from the village who helped in the kitchens, who first noticed the strangers. She had approached Cynthia during a lull in the festivities, her face pale with worry. "My lady," she had whispered, "there are men in the courtyard who were not invited. They wear no colors, and they watch the doors like wolves." Cynthia had felt her blood turn to ice. But before she could respond, James had appeared at her side. He had heard Carol's warning, and his face had gone grim. "How many?" he asked quietly. "At least a dozen, sir, maybe more." James had nodded curtly, then leaned close to Cynthia's ear. "Stay near me," he had murmured, "and be ready to run if I tell you to." The attack had come moments later, just as the musicians were beginning a new song. The great doors had burst open, and armed men had poured into the hall like a dark tide. The guests had screamed and scattered, overturning tables and chairs in their panic to escape. But Cynthia had seen immediately that there was no random violence here. The attackers moved with purpose, cutting down anyone who tried to protect her while ignoring those who fled. James had reacted instantly, his sword appearing in his hand as if by magic. He had fought his wife to her side through the chaos, his blade cutting down two men before they could reach her. "This way," he had shouted over the din, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a side door that led to the courtyard. But the courtyard had been no refuge. More attackers had been waiting there, and it was in that stone-walled space that the real battle had begun. James had fought like a man possessed, his sword work brutal and efficient. But there had been so many of them, and Cynthia had realized with growing horror that they were not trying to kill her quickly. They wanted her alive, at least long enough to make her suffer. It was then that she had understood the true nature of the trap that had been laid for her. Someone had used her wedding as the perfect opportunity to eliminate her and claim her lands. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, and the attackers too well informed about the castle's layout to be mere brigands. As James cut down another attacker, Cynthia's mind raced through the possibilities. Who stood to gain from her death? Wayne Powell, her father's cousin, was the obvious suspect, but he had been among the wedding guests and had seemed genuinely surprised by the attack. Ryan Carter had been furious about her choice of husband, but would he really resort to murder? Or was there someone else, someone she had not even considered? The answer came from an unexpected source. As James engaged three attackers at once, his movements becoming more desperate as fatigue began to tell, a familiar voice cut through the noise of battle. "Enough," Peter Carter called out, stepping into the courtyard with a dozen more armed men at his back. "Stand down, Sir James. You have fought well, but this ends now." Cynthia felt the world tilt around her as the betrayal became clear. Peter, her father's trusted advisor, the man who had guided her through these difficult months, was behind the attack. "Why, she whispered, though she was not sure he could hear her over the sound of her own heartbeat. Peter's smile was cold and satisfied. "Because your father was a fool to think a bastard daughter could rule these lands. Because Wayne Powell offered me a better arrangement than serving a girl who knows nothing of power. And because some secrets are too dangerous to let live." James had gone very still, his sword still raised, but his eyes fixed on Peter with an intensity that made the air seem to crackle. "What secrets?" "Ask your wife," Peter said mockingly. "Ask her what her father really told her about her birth, about why he never acknowledged her until his deathbed, about what her mother really was." Cynthia felt confusion join the fear and betrayal churning in her chest. Her mother had always been vague about her father, claiming only that he was a lord who could not marry beneath his station. But Peter's words suggested there was more to the story, something that made her existence a threat to someone. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite everything. "Of course you don't," Peter replied. "Your father was too much of a coward to tell you the truth. But Wayne Powell knows. He knows that your mother was not just some village girl who caught a lord's fancy. She was a witch, Cynthia, a woman with power that she passed on to you, and that makes you too dangerous to live." The word witch hung in the air like a physical blow. Cynthia felt her knees go weak as memories suddenly took on new meaning. Her mother's uncanny ability to know when storms were coming, the way plants grew better in their garden than anywhere else in the village, the strange dreams Cynthia sometimes had, dreams that seemed to show her glimpses of the future. "That's impossible," she breathed. But even as she said it, she knew it was not. Too many small incidents throughout her life suddenly made sense. The way animals seemed drawn to her. The time she had known her neighbor was going to fall ill days before the first symptoms appeared. The strange tingling she sometimes felt in her fingertips when she was angry or afraid. James stepped closer to her, his sword still raised, but his attention divided between the armed men surrounding them and her face. "It doesn't matter what she is," he said firmly. "She is my wife, and I will protect her." Peter laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "How touching, the cursed knight protecting the witch's daughter. Do you know what they called him before he came here, Cynthia? The kinslayer. He murdered his own lord, his own brothers in arms, during the siege of Raven's Hollow. Your father took him in because no one else would have him." Cynthia felt James flinch beside her, but he did not lower his weapon. "That was war," he said quietly, "and they were not the men I thought they were." "They were good men who trusted you," Peter spat, "just as your father trusted me, just as she trusts you now. But trust is a weakness, and weakness gets people killed." The philosophical debate was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones. More riders were entering the courtyard, and for a moment Cynthia thought they were more of Peter's allies. But then she saw the banner they carried, and hope flared in her chest. Janet Anderson, the captain of her father's guard, rode at the head of a dozen mounted soldiers. The older woman's face was grim as she took in the scene before her, but her sword was already in her hand. "Stand down, Peter Carter," she commanded. "By order of the crown, you are under arrest for treason and murder." Peter's confident expression faltered. "The crown has no authority here. These are internal matters." "The crown has authority everywhere," Janet replied coolly, "especially when it comes to the murder of lords and the theft of their lands. Did you really think Wayne Powell could move against a legitimate heir without the king's notice?" Cynthia felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman who had served her father faithfully for 20 years. But she could also see that the odds were still not in their favor. Peter's men outnumbered Janet's soldiers, and they were already in position. The standoff stretched taut as both sides weighed their options. Then James made his choice. With a roar that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he launched himself into the nearest group of attackers. His sword cut through them like wheat before a scythe, and his fury was so intense that even Peter's hardened mercenaries fell back in shock. The courtyard erupted into chaos as Janet's soldiers charged into the fray. Cynthia found herself pressed against the wall again, watching in fascination and terror as the battle raged around her. But this time, she was not merely a helpless observer. Something was stirring within her, a power she had never acknowledged or understood. As she watched James fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, she felt that familiar tingling in her fingertips grow stronger. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and she could swear she felt the stones of the castle walls responding to her touch. Without fully understanding what she was doing, she pressed her palms against the cold stone and reached out with her mind. The effect was immediate and startling. The torches lining the courtyard flared brighter, casting dancing shadows that seemed to confuse Peter's men. The cobblestones beneath their feet became slick with moisture that had not been there moments before. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rumble of thunder, though the sky had been clear moments before. Peter noticed the changes immediately, his eyes fixing on her with a mixture of fear and hatred. "Kill her now," he screamed at his men, "before she comes into her full power." But it was too late. The storm Cynthia had unconsciously summoned was already breaking over the castle. Rain began to fall in sheets, making footing treacherous and visibility poor. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the battle in stark, strobing light. And through it all, James fought on, his movements becoming more fluid and deadly, as if the storm had awakened something primal within him as well. The battle in the courtyard had become a nightmare of flashing steel and screaming wind. Cynthia pressed herself against the castle wall, rain streaming down her face as she watched her new husband fight for both their lives. The power that had awakened within her was growing stronger with each passing moment, but she had no idea how to control it. Lightning cracked overhead, and she felt it echo in her bones. James moved through Peter's men like death incarnate, his sword cutting down anyone who came within reach. But there were so many of them, and she could see exhaustion beginning to slow his movements. Janet Anderson and her soldiers were holding their own, but they were outnumbered and fighting in conditions that favored no one. "You cannot win," Peter shouted over the storm, his voice carrying despite the wind and rain. "Even if you kill every man I brought, Wayne Powell has an army marching on this castle. By dawn, you will both be dead, and these lands will have a proper lord." Cynthia felt despair wash over her, colder than the rain soaking through her wedding dress. Even if they survived this immediate threat, they would face a larger force in the morning. And she was beginning to understand that her newfound abilities, whatever they were, came with a cost. She could feel something draining from her with each flash of lightning, each gust of wind that answered her unconscious call. It was then that Carol Walker appeared at her side, the young kitchen maid somehow having made her way through the battle unnoticed. "My lady," she gasped, pressing something into Cynthia's hand. "Your mother sent this. She said you would know when to use it." Cynthia looked down at the object in her palm and felt her breath catch. It was a small pendant, carved from some dark stone she did not recognize. But as her fingers closed around it, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her body heat. And with that warmth came knowledge flowing into her mind like water into a dry riverbed. Her mother had not just been a witch, she had been a guardian, one of a line of women charged with protecting the ancient powers that slept beneath the earth. The pendant was a focus, a tool that would allow Cynthia to channel those powers safely. But using it would also mark her as what she truly was, making it impossible to hide her nature any longer. James appeared at her side suddenly, his armor dented and bloodied, but his eyes still fierce. "We need to get you out of here," he said urgently. "Janet's men are falling back. We cannot hold them much longer." "No," Cynthia said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I will not run anymore. This is my home, my responsibility, and I will not let Peter Carter destroy everything my father built." She held up the pendant, and James's eyes widened as he saw it. "Cynthia, what is that?" "My birthright," she replied, and closed her fist around the stone. The change was immediate and overwhelming. Power rushed through her like a river breaking through a dam, filling every cell of her body with electric energy. The storm above responded instantly, growing in intensity until the rain became a torrent and the lightning turned the night into day. But more than that, she could feel the castle itself awakening around her, ancient stones remembering the power that had once flowed through them. Peter's men began to fall back as the very ground beneath their feet started to tremble. The castle walls seemed to pulse with inner light, and the air itself became charged with an energy that made their weapons feel heavy in their hands. But it was Peter himself who bore the brunt of Cynthia's newfound power. "You want to know what I am?" she called out, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the storm. "You want to know why my father kept me secret all these years?" It was not shame, Peter Carter. It was protection. Protection for men like you, who would not survive the truth. She raised her hand, and lightning answered her call, striking the ground at Peter's feet. He stumbled backward, his face pale with terror, but there was nowhere for him to run. The courtyard had become a circle of power with Cynthia at its center, and she was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived at the castle 3 months ago. "I am the daughter of Lord Kevin Bailey and the witch Elena Flores," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am the guardian of these lands and the keeper of the old ways, and you, Peter Carter, have made a grave mistake in thinking you could take what is mine." The pendant in her hand was growing warm, almost hot, as she drew more power through it. She could feel the ancient magic of the land responding to her call, rising up from deep places where it had slept for generations. but she could also feel James beside her, his presence somehow anchoring her to her humanity, even as the power threatened to sweep her away. "Cynthia," he said quietly, his hand touching her arm, "be careful. Power like this can consume you if you let it." She looked at him, seeing concern and something deeper in his dark eyes. "You are not afraid of me?" "I am afraid for you," he replied, "but not of you, never of you." His words gave her the strength to pull back from the edge of the abyss that had opened within her. The storm began to calm, though the power still hummed through her veins like music. Around the courtyard, Peter's surviving men were throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. Their leader stood alone in the center of the space, his confidence finally broken. "Please," Peter gasped, falling to his knees in the muddy courtyard. "I was only following orders. Wayne Powell promised me lands, gold, a title of my own. I never meant for it to go this far." Cynthia looked down at the man who had betrayed her father's trust and tried to murder her on her wedding night. The power still sang in her veins, and it would be so easy to end him with a thought. Lightning still flickered overhead, waiting for her command. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of life and death in her hands, she realized that this moment would define who she chose to become. "You served my father faithfully for 15 years, she said finally, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "That service earned you the right to a clean death, not the torture you planned for me. But it does not earn you forgiveness." She raised her hand and Peter closed his eyes, waiting for the killing blow. But instead of lightning, Cynthia called down something else entirely. A soft, golden light enveloped the traitor, and when it faded, he was gone. Not dead, but transported far from her lands, stripped of his memories of this place and the power he had witnessed here. "Exile," she explained to James, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Let him wander the world as a beggar, never remembering what he lost or why." Janet Anderson approached them cautiously, her sword still drawn, but her eyes filled with something like awe. "My lady, the remaining attackers have surrendered. But we still have the problem of Wayne Powell's army. They will be here by dawn." Cynthia nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders like a mantle. "Then we will be ready for them. Send word to all the villages under our protection. Tell them that their lady has come into her power and that she will defend them with her life." As Janet hurried away to carry out her orders, James moved closer to Cynthia. The storm had finally passed, leaving the courtyard littered with debris and the smell of rain-washed stone. Her wedding dress was ruined beyond repair, but she had never felt more beautiful or more powerful. "There is something you should know," James said quietly, his eyes fixed on the pendant, still glowing softly in her hand. "About what Peter said, about Raven's Hollow." Cynthia waited, sensing that this was important to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. "I did kill my lord and my brothers in arms," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not for the reasons Peter claimed. They had made a pact with dark forces, agreed to sacrifice the innocent people of the city in exchange for victory in the siege. When I discovered their plan, I tried to reason with them. When that failed, I did what I had to do to protect those who could not protect themselves." "And afterward?" she asked gently. "Afterward, I was branded a kinslayer and a traitor. No lord would take me in, no army would have me. I wandered for 2 years, selling my sword to merchants and farmers, anyone who needed protection and did not ask too many questions about my past. Until your father found me, half dead from fever and starvation, and gave me a chance at redemption." Cynthia reached out and touched his scarred hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard fighting. "And now? Now I serve you," he said simply. "Not because of any debt to your father, but because I choose to. Because I have seen what you are capable of, both the power and the mercy, and I want to help you build something worthy of both." The words sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the connection she felt growing between them. This was not the marriage she had imagined as a young girl, born of romantic love and fairy tale dreams. But it was something deeper and more real, a partnership forged in fire and sealed with trust. "Then we face whatever comes together," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The rest of the night passed in a blur of preparation. Word spread quickly through the castle, in the surrounding villages that their lady had revealed herself as more than mortal. Some fled in terror, but most stayed, drawn by curiosity and loyalty to the family that had protected them for generations. By dawn, the castle walls were lined with archers, and the courtyard filled with men and women ready to fight for their home. Wayne Powell's army appeared with the sunrise, a force of nearly 200 mounted knights and men-at-arms. They rode under banners that proclaimed their leader's claim to the lands, but they stopped short when they saw the defenders waiting for them. Word of the previous night's events had clearly reached them, because Wayne himself rode forward under a flag of truce. Cynthia met him at the castle gates, dressed in her mother's armor that Carol Peterson had found in a forgotten chest. The steel was black as midnight and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. James stood at her right hand, while Janet Anderson commanded the archers on the walls above. Wayne Powell was a man in his 50s, gray-haired and stern-faced, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But when he looked at Cynthia, she saw uncertainty in his eyes, and she knew that the stories of her power had preceded her. "Niece," he said formally, inclining his head slightly, "I come to claim what is rightfully mine, as the nearest male heir to Kevin Bailey's lands." "Uncle," Cynthia replied, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "I come to defend what is rightfully mine, as Kevin Bailey's acknowledged daughter and heir." Wayne's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, as if sensing the tension in the air. "You are a bastard and a woman. The law does not recognize your claim." "The law recognizes the claim of whoever has the power to enforce it," Cynthia said calmly, "and I think we both know where that power lies." As if to emphasize her point, the morning mist began to swirl around the castle walls, forming shapes that looked almost like warriors made of vapor and shadow. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, and she could see Wayne's men shifting uneasily in their saddles. "I offer you a choice, Uncle," she continued. "Withdraw your army and return to your own lands. Acknowledge my rule here, and I will treat you with the respect due to family. Continue this path, and I will defend my people with every power at my disposal." Wayne was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Cynthia to the mist wraiths on the walls to the determined faces of the defenders. She could see him calculating odds, weighing the stories he had heard against the force he had brought to bear. "You would use witchcraft against your own blood?" he asked finally. "I would use whatever tools I possess to protect the innocent," she replied. "Just as my husband used his sword last night to protect me. Just as these people are willing to use their lives to protect their homes. Power is not evil, Uncle, only the use to which it is put." James stepped forward slightly, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Your niece speaks of wisdom, my lord. I have seen what happens when good people do nothing in the face of evil. I will not see it happen again." Wayne's gaze fixed on James with obvious distaste. "The kinslayer speaks of good and evil. How fitting." "The kinslayer speaks from experience," James replied evenly. "I know the cost of choosing power over people. I know what it looks like when men sell their souls for advantage. And I know that sometimes the only way to stop such men is with a sword." The two men stared at each other across the space between the castle gate and Wayne's horse, and Cynthia could feel the weight of old grievances and older choices hanging in the air between them. But it was her voice that broke the silence. "This is your last chance, Uncle. I do not wish to spill blood today, but I will not allow you to harm my people." Wayne looked around at his army, then back at the castle walls where the mist warriors still stood ready. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. "You have grown strong, niece, stronger than your father ever was. Perhaps that is what these lands need." He raised his hand and his army began to wheel their horses around, preparing to withdraw. But as they turned to go, Wayne called back one final warning. "You have won this day, Cynthia Bailey, but power like yours draws attention from places you cannot imagine. There are those who will not be content to let you rule in peace." With that ominous prophecy, Wayne Powell and his army rode away, leaving only dust and the memory of what might have been a devastating battle. Cynthia watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had won her first real test as a ruler, but she knew it would not be her last. As the crowd of defenders began to disperse, James moved to stand beside her. "He is right, you know, about the attention your power will draw." I know, she said quietly, but I cannot hide what I am anymore, and I will not abandon the people who depend on me. Then we will face whatever comes, he said, echoing her words from the night before. Together. The word carried more weight now than it had in the darkness of the courtyard. They had been tested by fire and emerged not just alive, but stronger. The marriage that had begun as a political necessity was becoming something deeper, a true partnership between two people who understood the cost of power and the responsibility it carried. Over the following weeks, life in the castle settled into a new rhythm. Cynthia threw herself into learning the intricacies of rule, guided by Janet Anderson and the other loyal members of her father's council. She discovered that governing required as much strength as wielding magic, though the challenges were different. Mediating disputes between villages, managing the harvest, preparing for winter, all of these tasks demanded her attention and her wisdom. James proved to be invaluable in these efforts, his experience as a knight giving him insights into military matters, while his years of wandering had taught him about the concerns of common people. Together they worked to strengthen the defenses of their lands and improve the lives of those under their protection. But it was in the quiet moments, late at night, when the castle slept around them, that their relationship truly began to deepen. They would sit together in the solar, she working on correspondence while he maintained his weapons, and talk about everything and nothing. She learned about his childhood as the youngest son of a minor lord, how he had dreamed of glory and honor before discovering the brutal realities of war. He learned about her years in the village, the simple pleasures of tending a garden, and the quiet wisdom of her mother. It was during one of these evening conversations that Cynthia finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her since their wedding night. Do you regret it? Marrying me, I mean. You could have found a normal wife, someone who would not bring danger and strangeness into your life. James was silent for so long that she began to fear she had overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he set down the sword he had been sharpening and looked at her with an expression that made her heart skip. I spent 2 years believing I was cursed, he said quietly, that everyone I cared about would suffer because of what I had done, what I had become. Your father was the first person to show me that redemption was possible, that a man could change his fate through his choices. But it was you who showed me that some things are worth the risk. What things? She whispered. Love, he said simply. Partnership. The chance to build something good in a world that often seems determined to tear down anything beautiful. The word love hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Cynthia felt her breath catch as she realized that what had begun as mutual respect and shared necessity had indeed grown into something deeper. She had fallen in love with her husband's quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, his willingness to stand between her and any threat. I love you too, she said, the words feeling both natural and momentous. I did not expect to, but I do. When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the formal peck that had sealed their wedding vows. This was a kiss that spoke of passion held in check, of desire tempered by respect, of two people choosing to trust each other with their hearts as well as their lives. Their first months of marriage had been a time of discovery and growth, but it was also a time of preparation. Wayne's warning about the attention her power would draw proved prophetic. Travelers brought word of strange happenings in distant lands, of other women like Cynthia being hunted by those who feared what they represented. There were rumors of a new crusade being organized, not against foreign infidels, but against the ancient powers that some claimed were rising again. We need allies, Janet Anderson told them one morning as they discussed reports from their scouts. Other lords who will stand with us if the worst happens. And how do we find such allies? Cynthia asked. Most nobles would rather see me dead than acknowledge what I am. Not all, James said thoughtfully. There are others like us, people who have been cast out or marked as different. The question is how to find them without exposing ourselves to our enemies. It was Kelly Diaz, a young woman who had recently joined their household as a scribe, who provided the answer. She had come to them from the south, fleeing persecution for her ability to read the future in the stars. There is a network, she told them quietly one evening. People like us who have learned to recognize each other. We use signs, symbols, ways of speaking that identify us to our own kind while remaining invisible to those who would harm us. Through Kelly's connections, they began to make contact with others who possessed unusual abilities or who had been marked as outcasts by conventional society. A lord whose lands were protected by an ancient pact with the forest spirits. A merchant whose ships never foundered because she could speak to the winds. A knight whose sword had been blessed by powers older than any church. Slowly, carefully, they began to build a network of mutual support and protection. It was dangerous work, requiring absolute discretion and trust. But it was also hopeful work, proof that they were not alone in a world that often seemed hostile to anything that challenged its narrow definitions of normal. As winter approached, Cynthia found herself changing in ways that had nothing to do with magic. The frightened girl who had arrived at the castle 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own power and was not afraid to use it. She had learned to balance mercy with strength, to lead with wisdom rather than fear. But perhaps the most important change was in her relationship with James. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had become a true partnership, built on love and mutual respect. They worked together, fought together, and dreamed together of a future where people like them could live openly without fear. It was on the first night of the new year that their world changed again. Cynthia woke from a dream that felt more like a vision, her heart pounding with urgency. In her dream, she had seen armies marching under banners she did not recognize, led by men in white robes who carried weapons blessed by priests. They were coming for her, for all of them, and they would not be turned aside by words or warnings. "James," she whispered, shaking her husband awake, "we need to send word to our allies. The war is coming." He was instantly alert, the soldier in him responding to the tone in her voice. "How long do we have?" "Months, maybe less. They are calling it a holy crusade, a war to cleanse the land of unnatural influences. But it is really about fear, about people who cannot accept that the world is larger and stranger than they want to believe." James sat up, already reaching for his clothes. "Then we had better be ready for them." Yeed. The preparations for war consumed the next 3 months. Messages flew back and forth between the castle and their scattered allies, carried by riders who knew how to avoid the increasingly frequent patrols of Crusader scouts. Weapons were sharpened, defenses strengthened, and plans made for a conflict that would determine not just their survival, but the future of everyone like them. Cynthia threw herself into the work with an intensity that sometimes worried James. She spent hours each day practicing with her powers, pushing herself to new limits and exploring abilities she had never known she possessed. The pendant her mother had sent her had become a constant presence around her neck, its dark stone pulsing with inner light. Whenever she drew upon the ancient forces it helped her channel. "You are pushing too hard," James told her one evening, finding her in the castle's highest tower, where she had been communing with the elemental forces of wind and storm. "Power without rest leads to exhaustion, and exhausted leaders make poor decisions." She turned to him, and he was struck by how much she had changed since their wedding day. The uncertain girl was completely gone now, replaced by a woman who radiated confidence and authority. But there was something else in her eyes, a hardness that had not been there before. "I cannot afford to be weak," as she said, "not with what is coming. Our scouts report that the Crusader army numbers in the thousands. Even with our allies, we will be vastly outnumbered." "Numbers are not everything," James replied, moving to stand beside her at the tower window. "We have advantages they do not. We know this land, we have the loyalty of the people, and we have powers they do not understand." "And they have the backing of kings and churches," Cynthia countered. "They have gold to buy mercenaries and priests to bless their weapons. They have the righteousness of those who believe they are doing God's work." James was quiet for a moment, looking out over the lands they had sworn to protect. In the distance, he could see the lights of the village, where people were going about their evening routines, trusting that their lady would keep them safe. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it was also clarifying. "Do you remember what you told me on our wedding night?" he asked finally, "about facing whatever comes together?" "I remember." "Then trust in that. Trust in us, in what we have built here. We may not have the numbers or the gold, but we have something they do not. We have each other, and we have the knowledge that we are fighting for something worth preserving." His words reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. In a world that often seemed determined to tear down anything beautiful or different, James represented the possibility that some things could endure. Their marriage, their partnership, their commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. "You are right," she said, leaning against his shoulder and feeling some of the tension leave her body. "I have been so focused on preparing for war that I forgot what we are really fighting for." "Peace," he said simply. "The right to live as we choose, to love whom we choose, to use our gifts in service of good rather than having to hide them in shame." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carol Walker, who climbed the tower stairs with a message that had just arrived by Raven. The young woman was out of breath, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "My lady, my lord," she gasped. "Word from Lord Marcus in the eastern provinces. His scouts report that the Crusader army has split into 3 columns. They plan to attack simultaneously from different directions, hoping to overwhelm our defenses through sheer numbers." Cynthia took the message and read it quickly, her strategic mind already working through the implications. 3 columns means they are dividing their strength. If we can defeat one column decisively, it might cause the others to lose heart. "Which column do we target?" James asked, studying the rough map that had been included with the message. "The center column," Cynthia said without hesitation. "It is led by Brother Augustine, the priest who has been preaching against us in the southern cities. He is their spiritual leader, the one who gives their cause legitimacy. If we can defeat him, capture or kill him, it will shake their faith in their righteous mission." James nodded approvingly. "A sound strategy, but it will require us to leave the castle, to meet them in open battle rather than defending from behind walls." "Yes," Cynthia agreed, "and it will require me to use my powers in ways I have never attempted before. I will need to call upon forces that have slept for centuries, awaken guardians that have not walked the earth since the old days." The magnitude of what she was proposing hit them both at the same time. This would not be a simple battle between armies, but a clash between the 2 different visions of what the world should be. On one side, the Crusaders with their rigid certainties and their fear of anything they could not control. On the other, Cynthia and her allies with their acceptance of mystery and their belief that diversity of power and thought made the world stronger. "When do we march?" James asked. And she heard in his voice the same determination that had carried him through the darkest moments of his past. "In 3 days," she replied. "That will give us time to gather our allies and prepare for what may be the most important battle of our lives." The army that assembled in the fields outside Cynthia's castle 3 days later was unlike anything that had been seen in those lands for generations. Alongside the traditional knights and men-at-arms rode figures that seemed to have stepped out of legend. There was Lady Margaret, whose armor was grown rather than forged, made from the living wood of ancient trees. Sir Thomas rode a horse that was more shadow than flesh, a mount that had been gifted to him by the spirits of the dead he had helped to rest. Kelly Diaz carried a staff topped with a crystal that captured starlight, while Janet Anderson's sword hummed with power drawn from the iron heart of the earth itself. At the center of this extraordinary force rode Cynthia and James, their black armor matching and their purpose unified. The pendant around Cynthia's neck pulsed with steady light, while James's sword seemed to drink in the morning sun and transform it into something darker and more purposeful. They rode toward the appointed battlefield in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the day would bring. Cynthia found herself thinking about her mother, wondering if the woman who had given her life was watching from whatever realm the dead inhabited. She thought about her father, the man she had barely known, but whose legacy she was fighting to preserve. Most of all, she thought about the people in the villages behind them, the ordinary men and women whose lives would be shaped by the outcome of this battle. The Crusader army was already waiting when they arrived at the ancient stone circle that had been chosen as the meeting ground. Brother Augustine had positioned his forces carefully, with heavy cavalry on the flanks and archers in the center. Banners bearing religious symbols fluttered in the morning breeze, and the sun glinted off blessed weapons and holy armor. But it was Augustine himself who drew Cynthia's attention. The priest sat his horse in the center of his army, a tall figure in white robes that seemed to glow with inner light. His face was stern and uncompromising, the face of a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his cause. When he saw Cynthia approaching under her own banner, his expression hardened further. "So," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the field, "the witch finally shows herself. I had expected someone more impressive." Cynthia rode forward until she was within easy speaking distance, James at her side and her most trusted allies arrayed behind her. "And I had expected someone less predictable," she replied calmly. "Tell me, Brother Augustine, what do you hope to accomplish here today?" "The cleansing of these lands," he said without hesitation, "the elimination of unnatural influences that corrupt the faithful and lead them astray from the true path." "And who decides what is natural?" Cynthia asked. "You, your church, your king, or perhaps the people who actually live on these lands and benefit from the protection I offer them?" Augustine's face twisted with disgust. "The people are sheep, easily led astray by false promises and dark magic. It is the duty of their betters to guide them back to the light, even if they resist." "There it is," James said quietly, but loud enough for many to hear. "The truth behind all the righteous words. You do not fight for the people, brother. You fight to control them." "I fight for their souls," Augustine shot back, "something a kinslayer and a witch would not understand." "I understand more than you think," James replied, his hand moving to rest on his sword hilt. "I understand what happens when good men convince themselves that evil acts serve a higher purpose. I understand the cost of choosing certainty over compassion." The exchange was interrupted by a sound that made everyone on the battlefield look up in wonder and terror. From the ancient stones of the circle came a deep, resonant hum, as if the earth itself was awakening. Cynthia had begun to call upon the powers that slept beneath the sacred ground, and they were answering. "Last chance, Brother Augustine," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. "Withdraw your army and return to your churches. I do not wish to demonstrate why your ancestors feared places like this." Augustine's response was to raise his blessed sword high above his head. "For God and the true faith," he screamed, "charge!" The Crusader army surged forward with a roar that shook the ground. But as they approached the stone circle, they began to slow, their horses becoming increasingly reluctant to enter the sacred space. Some of the animals refused entirely, rearing and backing away despite their riders' spurs and curses. Cynthia raised her own hand, and the stones began to glow with the same light as her pendant. From the earth between them rose figures of mist and shadow, the guardians of the ancient places awakening after centuries of sleep. They moved to intercept the charging crusaders, their touch draining the blessing from holy weapons and the certainty from righteous hearts. The battle that followed was like nothing recorded in any chronicle. Steel clashed against steel, but it was accompanied by forces that belonged more to legend than to history. Lightning called down from clear skies, struck blessed banners, and turned them to ash. The earth itself opened to swallow those who would desecrate the sacred ground. And through it all, Cynthia stood at the center of the stone circle, her power flowing through the ancient conduits and into the world. But the Crusaders were not helpless. Augustine and his priests had brought weapons of their own, relics and artifacts blessed by generations of faith. Holy water burned the shadow guardians like acid, while blessed silver pierced their misty forms. The battle swayed back and forth, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. It was James who turned the tide. Seeing that Cynthia was beginning to weaken from the enormous effort of channeling so much power, he spurred his horse forward and challenged Augustine to single combat. The priest accepted immediately, confident that his blessed weapons would prevail against a mere mortal warrior. They met in the center of the battlefield, their armies drawing back to give them room. Augustine's sword blazed with holy light, while James's blade seemed to absorb all illumination around it. When the weapons met, the sound was like thunder, and sparks of conflicting energies flew in all directions. The duel between James and Augustine became the focal point of the entire battle. Around them, the larger conflict continued to rage, but every eye was drawn to the two figures circling each other in the center of the ancient stone circle. Augustine fought with the fervor of absolute certainty, his blessed blade seeking to cut down the man he saw as a servant of darkness. James fought with the skill born of hard experience and the strength that came from protecting what he loved most. "You cannot win, Kinslayer," Augustine panted as their swords locked together. God fights on my side. Then your God is weaker than I thought, James replied, breaking the lock and stepping back to circle again. Because I fight for love, and that is stronger than any blessing. Their blades met again and again, each strike sending shockwaves through the spiritual fabric of the battlefield. Cynthia watched from her position at the center of the stones, still channeling power but unable to help directly without risking harm to James. She could see that her husband was holding his own, but Augustine was no mere priest. He had been trained by the church's finest warriors, and his blade carried centuries of accumulated blessing. It was then that she realized what she had to do. The pendant around her neck was not just a focus for her power, but a key to something much greater. Her mother had not just been a guardian of the old ways, but a keeper of ancient knowledge that predated both church and crown. And that knowledge included the true names of the powers that slept beneath the earth. Guardians of the deep places, she called out, her voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity. Keepers of the first covenant, protectors of the sacred trust. I call upon you in the name of Elena Flores, daughter of the ancient line. I call upon you to witness this battle and judge between those who would preserve and those who would destroy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The stones of the circle began to pulse with light that hurt to look at directly. From deep beneath the earth came a sound like the world's heartbeat, slow and powerful and utterly implacable. And from the spaces between the stones, stepping figures that belonged to the world's youth, when the boundaries between mortal and divine were not yet fixed. Augustine faltered as he saw them, his blessed sword suddenly feeling heavy in his hands. These were not the demons his church had taught him to expect, but something far older and more primal. They were the powers that had shaped the world before human civilization had even begun, and they regarded his small crusade with the indifference of mountains watching the passage of seasons. Impossible, he whispered, his certainty cracking for the first time. They are just legends, stories told by pagans and heretics. Everything is legend until it stands before you, James said, and pressed his attack while the priest was distracted. Augustine's defenses crumbled under the assault. His blessed blade, so confident in its righteousness moments before, now seemed clumsy and slow. James's sword found its mark, piercing the priest's side and sending him to his knees on the ancient stones. Yield, James commanded, his blade at Augustine's throat. Call off your army and acknowledge defeat. Augustine looked up at him with eyes full of hatred and confusion. I cannot, I will not. Better to die than to submit to darkness. Then you understand nothing, Cynthia said, approaching them both. The ancient guardians parted before her like mist, acknowledging her authority. This was never about darkness and light, good and evil. It was about fear and acceptance, control and freedom. She knelt beside the wounded priest, and to everyone's surprise placed her hands on his injury. Light flowed from her fingers, not the harsh radiance of his blessed weapons, but something warm and healing. The wound closed under her touch, leaving only a scar to mark where it had been. I could kill you, she said quietly. The power is mine, and you have given me cause. But I choose mercy instead. Not because you deserve it, but because mercy is what separates us from those who would rule through fear. Augustine stared at her in shock, unable to reconcile her actions with everything he had been taught about witches and their evil nature. Why, he whispered. Because someone must choose to break the cycle, she replied. Someone must be willing to show that power can be used for healing instead of harm, for protection instead of conquest. Your army came here to destroy what they feared. I choose to preserve what can be saved. She stood and looked out over the battlefield, where the fighting had gradually stopped as both sides watched the confrontation between their leaders. The battle is over, she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the field. Those who wish to leave may do so freely. Those who wish to stay and learn what we truly represent are welcome to remain. To everyone's surprise, it was Augustine who spoke first. I will stay, he said, struggling to his feet with James's help. I need to understand what I have seen here today. I need to know if everything I believed was wrong. His words seemed to break a dam, and suddenly crusaders were laying down their weapons and removing their helms. Not all of them, but enough to show that the day had changed more than just the military balance of power. It had opened minds and hearts that had been closed by fear and ignorance. In the days that followed, as the various armies dispersed and returned to their homes, Cynthia found herself facing a new kind of challenge. Victory in battle was one thing, but building a lasting peace was something else entirely. She worked with Augustine and other former enemies to establish new understandings, new ways of thinking about power and responsibility that could bridge the gap between the old ways and the new. James stood beside her through it all, her partner in peace as he had been in war. Their love had been forged in crisis and tested by conflict, but it had emerged stronger than ever. Together, they began to build something that had never existed before. A society where those with unusual gifts could live openly, where diversity of power was seen as strength rather than threat. The castle that had once been her father's became a beacon for those seeking a new way of living. Scholars came to study the ancient knowledge she helped preserve. Healers came to learn how power could be used for restoration rather than destruction. Young people with gifts they did not understand came seeking guidance and acceptance. And through it all, Cynthia remembered the frightened girl who had once tended a garden behind a cottage, never dreaming that she would one day reshape the world. The journey from that garden to this castle had been long and difficult, marked by loss and discovery, fear and courage, despair and hope. But it had led her to exactly where she belonged, standing beside the man she loved, protecting the people she served, and building a future worthy of the sacrifices that had made it possible. The pendant her mother had given her still hung around her neck, but it no longer pulsed with urgent power. Instead, it rested quietly against her heart, a reminder of where she had come from and a promise of what was yet to come. She was no longer just Cynthia Flores, the bastard daughter of a lord and a witch. She was Lady Cynthia Ortiz, guardian of the ancient ways and architect of a new world where love could triumph over fear, where understanding could overcome ignorance, and where two people who had found each other against all odds could build something beautiful and lasting together.